Welcome back to the Why Mindset Matters podcast. I'm Eslana Loa. I'm an author, speaker, resilience mindset coach. I'm a nurse, a midwife, and a mother of four. If this is somehow the first episode of mine that you have listened to, I want to start by providing a trigger warning. I do discuss the loss of my teenage daughter, Riley, to suicide. In this episode, I want to talk about how comparison is the thief of joy. In a day and age where we have so many options with regards to social media and apps and technology keeping us more connected than we've ever been, which is amazing. And it's so incredible that you can have family members that move away and have distance between you, but not feel that distance because of the connection that social media does facilitate. But at the same time, what we have is this tendency for comparison because now we have more access to everybody, and people that we never would have had access to before have a lot more access to comparison and be comparing ourselves, our lives, our relationships, our parenting, our jobs to everybody. It's actually ridiculous. And what is happening is we're seeing these very carefully curated versions of people's lives online with filters and, not to mention how long it might have taken them to take the right photo from the right angle to give you the perception that this is how happy they are or what their life looks like or what their body looks like. And really, technology and these apps cannot be trusted. Neither can the people who spend all of this time and energy, like I said, carefully curating the version of their life that they want to present to the world. And what happens is we view what they put out into the world, and whether we're aware of it or not, we subconsciously compare our life, our body, our relationship. And in doing so can really rob ourselves of a lot of the joy that is intended for us in life. And it's easy to see that when I put it in perspective like that. So I'm sure we can all relate to the potential for negative impact and effects that kind of comparison via social media can have. But I want to talk about comparison being the thief of joy in the context of grief and loss and our lived experience, because in the aftermath of losing Riley, something that I found, and I still find it, we're over 2.5 years later, and people will maybe always do it, but my hope is that that's not the case. What I'm finding, though, is that people have a tendency when we are talking to maybe bring up something, grief or loss of theirs in their life that they've experienced, or maybe they're bringing up something that somebody close to them or that they know has experienced. But as they do, what I'll find is that they will say, "Oh, but it doesn't compare to what you've been through." And it's an instinct, and I believe it's intended at avoiding offending, because we don't want to be perceived as if we're saying that this somehow compares or is the same or is worse than, or for whatever reason. And I would encourage you not to do that, because there's no version of me that thinks that my grief or loss or trauma is worse than anybody's. And I definitely don't want people robbing themselves of the potential for the potential that they have to experience joy in life by doing this. Because when you sit your grief and loss or your lived experience next to somebody else's, and in an attempt to maybe not offend, you lower yours because you deem it not as valid or not as severe or not as worthy or whatever it is, you think that it's not as bad. And let's be real. Obviously, I've been through some heavy shit that's unimaginable. So when we look at somebody's life experience or their grief or their loss, and it is unimaginable, then we can't even imagine comparing something like what we're talking about to that event, because we can't imagine going through it. So there's no version of me that would want to be seen by you to be comparing this thing to it. And I get that it comes from a good place, but what we're actually doing when we do that is invalidating our lived experience, because the environmental factors of how your grief and loss occurred or what it looks like isn't what matters. What matters the most is that it's valid, that it's dependent on your exposure in life. If your greatest sense of grief and loss that has rocked you and you haven't been able to come back from it is the loss of a pet, because that was the most genuine and unconditional love you'd ever experienced and you had to say goodbye, or maybe you didn't get to say goodbye, whether it's a relationship you thought was going to last longer or whether it was definitely the end. My point is that grief is valid. And anything that occurs in your life that's having a knock-on effect of stealing your joy or continuing to impact your activities of daily living or how you show up in life or just really continuing to impact you is valid. It could be something that, and I've had people mention things that are actually horrific and they still will go, oh, but it doesn't compare to what you've been through. And so my point with this is it doesn't matter what it is, how significant you think it is when you sit it next to mine. It's by comparing them that we rob ourselves, as I said, of the opportunity for joy, and I'm going to explain how. As I said, when we invalidate or deny the validity of our grief, our loss, we're denying the validity of our lived experience. And when we do so, grief presents an opportunity to walk back through the flames. And denial keeps us from doing that. Denial keeps us stuck in a reality where we don't get to move forward. We may end up living out our life as a victim of our circumstances and in martyrdom to our grief. But the flames of grief, the part that burns and has you convinced that it's going to be all-consuming and absolutely destroy you, is the part that if we have the courage to walk through it, to lean into grief and say yes to it and to acknowledge its validity, we can come out the other side. And I don't mean out the other side of grief, because grief never ends. What happens is you come out the other side of the flames actually stronger for it, because it's the heat that makes the diamonds. And it turns out rock bottom really was the beginning of a beautiful becoming. And I'm not suggesting that new becoming felt beautiful at all to be in the thick of it. You're in the fucking flames. It has you convinced that it's going to destroy you. And I can't say how long your path through those flames are, but sometimes you're getting up every day and walking back through the flames of grief in the most horrific ways. But what I can tell you is that one day, as you really do validate your lived experience, lean in and say yes to grief and do the things that I've been talking about in the episodes, you come out the other side of the flames. And it doesn't mean that grief stops being a bitch. It is. And it's heavy and it's hectic. But with the tools that I have been fortunate enough to be able to implement, to be able to become this version of myself who is on the other side of those flames and so in love with my life and experiencing so much peace and joy that I didn't know was possible and that I certainly had never experienced prior to my grief and loss. The capacity we have to really experience everything that life has to offer really pales in comparison to the gift that grief gives you. And initially I didn't see it as a gift. I saw it as the curse of grief, is that we live prior to grief and loss in a relatively superficial version of everything that we have, whether it's love, joy, passion, anger, like all of these negative things as well. We experience it on a surface level, and what grief and loss, significant loss, does is it peels back the layers and gives you no option but to see the capacity, the true capacity that we have to experience all of those things far exceeds anything we could imagine. The depths that we have to experience anger and rage that could lead you to homicide is on the other side of a major life event that could destroy you. But in the same sense, we have this depth of love and presence and joy that has the same weight and depth to it on the other side of these major life events that rip you open. And the difference between the two is the choices that we make as we do walk back through those flames. If we're going to implement the daily practice of gratitude and saying yes to grief and leaning into this rather than letting my ego be at the wheel, denying this event as if somehow its denial removes the fact that it's a fact or that it has occurred. And so it's whether we make the conscious and subconscious choices that we do to either perpetuate our suffering through denial and in a way that potentially feeds anger and introduces us to rage and resentment that's going to eat us alive from the inside, or whether those choices facilitate us learning how to live and grieve simultaneously in a way that not only honors the very thing or person that we have lost, but honors ourselves. It's not enough to choose kindness for those around us. We've got to choose it for ourselves. And one of the kindest things you can do in especially unanticipated grief and loss is be actually able and willing to have the courage to start to say yes to grief, to step outside of the denial, to validate your lived experience and acknowledge that it sucks and that it wasn't fair. And that's okay, because it's that acknowledgement that allows those emotions of yours to be seen and to be allowed and to be validated. Because when we deny their presence, it just pushes them down. They just live in a deeper place of us where they cause more harm. When we acknowledge them and allow them to be, we have the opportunity to release them, to choose which parts we hold on to choose who I'm going to let myself become as a result of this experience. Am I going to let the future version of me be dictated by the experiences of my past, or am I going to allow this to somehow be incorporated into my story and my lived experience and on this planet, but in a way that doesn't rule the house that is my soul or define what's left of my lived experience? And when we do these things, what happens is you can find yourself in the rubble of a life you no longer even recognize, feeling as though you're an alien on this planet who no longer speaks the native tongue, but also find your way to a lived experience filled with joy and peace and is completely rewarding, and that you actually love. And that you can look back at your life and find the things to be grateful for. And it's a really rewarding thing to find yourself doing. But comparison is the thief of that joy. Because like I said, when we put our grief, our lived experience, our loss, our version of what's happened and how it's affected us next to somebody else's, and in doing so lower it because we think it's less than or not comparable, we deny its validity. And in doing so, we deny our opportunity for the growth that transforms us into the version that can have the joy and the peace. I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm not. But there's no version of it that's going to be easy. There's no version of our life that's going to be easy. None of us actually get off scot-free. And anything that can happen at any time. So if we, instead of getting stuck comparing, whether it's online, whether it's social media, if we catch ourselves comparing our lived experience, our job, our relationship, ourselves as parents, our house, our belongings, our car, whatever it is, if we catch ourselves in amongst that behavior of comparison and try and pull back and really focus on what we're grateful for, then we start to break the habits of comparison. And in doing so, facilitate more presence in our life, more gratitude for what is. And if there's things that the comparison of online facilitates envy, then what do I need to do? Is this something that if I knew I could facilitate what was necessary in order for me to achieve and have that thing for myself, would I go after it? Because really everything is possible. So either use the opportunity that comparison facilitating the awareness of envy and go get it, or let it go, because the grass is never greener. And like I said, those people online are spending so much time to present a carefully curated version of their life and their events to you as if this is the be all and end all, or they're not even putting that much effort into it. You're just deciding by the very limited view of their life or their belongings or whatever it is that you think that lends itself to a more joyful, whatever, rewarding life experience. My point is, it's a trap. It's a trap. Comparison is definitely a trap, and it's not one that's going to lend itself to joy. I would start to bring your focus inward and look for the things that you can be grateful for, even in the rubble, even in amongst the grief experience, because there's always something. And who are we to determine anyone's term here? I truly believe that when your time is up, your time is up, and there's probably a contractual agreement or assignment that each of our souls has to be here for a certain term, and we don't know what that is. But the reality is that if we lost something or someone that really meant the world to us, how awesome that we had it in the beginning. How beautiful that life facilitated that connection, that relationship, that awareness of the kind of love that would lend itself to us missing them the way that we do. How incredible is the privilege to have shared our life with somebody who's left such an impact with their absence. And so it's all about the lens through which we view things, because if perhaps their absence was always going to be from this point onward, or the time at which they left this life, and our ego wants us to think that we somehow have control. If everything is contractually already assigned before we are even born, then how ridiculous is it that our ego is at the wheel of our life to begin with, but thinks that it can control aspects. And even if we're not aware as we're living that we have this egotistical tendency to believe that we have a sense of control, you see it in the aftermath of loss, when we go, if only I'd known. If only, and it would have been an easy place for us to go to with a child who took her life, grossly impacted by bullying and being groomed by her supervisor and all of these environmental factors that happened to her while she was vulnerable mentally. We could easily have fallen down the well of, if only we'd known. And trust me, it takes a lot of effort to not go down that rabbit hole of, why didn't anybody say something? Apparently she had voiced to her friends that she was suicidal. Like, you could go down this rabbit hole. People could go down this rabbit hole. Why didn't we say something? It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, that's our ego thinking that if we knew as her parents, somehow we could have changed what maybe is her contractual agreement with this life, to have been here for 15 years. And if somebody was sick, if we look back and go, if only we'd done things differently, we wanted their passing, for instance, to be better, or have somehow been less of this or more of that, or whatever. Again, it's our ego. And I don't mean to point that as if any of us are doing the wrong thing. I just mean our instinct for ego causes more suffering, because it's not on us to control. We did everything we could to show up as parents, to protect our children, and to really live as conscious parents. I was invested in my girls and getting them to adulthood okay and safe. I did everything I could, and I was so consciously invested in being present and doing whatever was necessary in order to facilitate these well-adjusted young adults I could release on the world and trust to be kind humans and make their own decisions. And I still lost her. There's so much of our life that we don't get to control. There's so much of our life where we can just do the right thing and shit still doesn't work out in a way that's fair. And our ego wants us to think that we somehow should have done better, that we somehow should have done more or known more, or it should have been different. That is all stuff that comes from our ego. And the ego will just lead you down a rabbit hole of suffering, and then one that perpetuates your suffering, because you end up on a spiral of thinking that somehow things could have been different. But at the end of the day, they're not. Things are what they are. And the best thing that we can do is live in a way that doesn't compare our lived experience to others, but rather endeavors to validate it, that we become our own best friend, that we talk to ourselves in the same way that any of you would talk to me. Nobody would tolerate me beating myself up over the things that I wish that I could have changed, or how I think things could have been different. There's no one in good conscience who could sit with a grieving parent and listen to them say or do anything that would perpetuate the heartache that they can see that you have to live with across the lifespan. And yet we don't turn that kindness and compassion inward. Why are we not validating our lived experience with just as much ease as you would mine? And I want you to never put your loss or your grief or your trauma next to anybody else's, unless it is in an attempt to share the validity of how our lived experience can suck a bag of dicks. And yet we can open ourselves up to this untapped resilience where we get to learn to live and grieve simultaneously in a way that lends itself to joy and peace, and how proud we are of ourselves and each other in this shared experience that is life. Because if life hasn't come for you yet, it will. And I don't say that to scare you. I'm just saying that anything that can happen at any time. And it's our ego that wants us to think that somehow if we do this, this, and this, we're immune to the very losses and, challenges of life that we see others, if not everyone around us, facing. And I honestly thought that by staying on the right side of the healthcare profession that I would be immune. I was helping people through grief and loss and trauma and illness for 20-something years. And I thought that if I just stay on this side of the line, then I'll be the helper, I'll be the carer. I won't be the one who's screaming that horrific sound because I lost my baby. But it's our ego that wants us in that spot where we think that we have any control over the things that are happening outside of ourselves. The one thing that I have learnt that I can control is the lens through which I choose to view the things that happen in my life and around it that I actually have no control over. And I choose to respect what I think is a fact, that we make a contractual agreement with this life to be here for a certain term, and like a weird game we are all playing. None of us get to see our card. We pick a card, and that's our agreement with life, and we don't get to see it, and we don't get to reveal it to others. But how we can navigate the awareness of that in a way that's not fearful or anxiety inducing is to just live the fuck out of this life. Live in the now. Show up the way that you want to show up, as who you want to be in the moment. Don't wait to arrive as a version of you in the future that's going to be somehow better or more loving and compassionate or present. Be it now. You never know when your time is up. And my one endeavor in considering all of this for my children is I really endeavor to help facilitate, knowing that I don't know what my term here will be, and I hope for a long life that I get to share with them. But I have no idea. I could maybe not be here tomorrow. We can't control that. And it's important to do the things we can control to foster good health and make healthy choices and show up in a way that protects ourselves from unnecessary risk. But the reality is I don't know how long I will get to spend with those I love. And what I want for them is to be able to facilitate enough of, I don't really have the words, whatever it is that they need to be able to navigate whatever term is left without me in more joy for what was and the fact that we got to share what we did than sorrow and overwhelm and sadness for what they thought was meant to be. Because I think that the capacity to really, really love the fuck out of our life right now, but also facilitate joy comes with the awareness that I don't know how long I've got, but I'm going to make the most of now. And I know that whoever you've lost, whoever you thought would be here longer and you wished was still here, the capacity to love them that much, I assume was met and facilitated by the capacity they had to love you in the same way. And if that's the case, there's no version of them in any realm that would want you to be causing more harm to your heart than is necessary in the aftermath of their loss. There's no version of Riley who would want or feel anything but like absolute heartache at the awareness that we were suffering more than we needed to, or that maybe we were punishing ourselves for what we perceived to have been our responsibility, or if we'd only known. The way she loved me, she would never want me talking to myself that way. And I don't believe that she took her life to cause harm to anyone. I don't believe she did it to hurt anyone. I believe that she did it to end her pain, and that because she had such a young and immature brain, she got herself into a dark hole that felt that the only out was through this door, through suicide and ending her life. And so she didn't do it to hurt anyone. And I know how much she loved us. every single one of us. And I know how much she loved and cared for all of the people closest to her in her life. And there's no version of her life or her soul that would want to cause harm to others. She just wanted her harm to end. And if we put it in perspective like that, we can appreciate the love that we shared with them and how much they loved us. And we can start to have compassion, hopefully, on ourselves that goes when we catch ourselves in those negative spirals of thinking about what we wish we could have changed or wish was different, or, to be able to put ourselves in their shoes and think about how they would speak to us, how they would love us, and with such ease that they would love us, and how much they wouldn't want us to be exacerbating our suffering. There's no version of me. If I wasn't here tomorrow, or I live until I'm 90 something and then I'm gone, I definitely don't want any of my children perpetuating their own suffering by wishing that things were different. I want them to be capable of sitting in the awareness of what was. And know that I lived a full fucking life. Yeah, the first half of it sucked a lot with a lot of bad shit, but it also made me who I am. And I got this beautiful love letter from one of my children yesterday that she had written about how I was her hero and how my capacity to show up as a loving and kind person, even in the aftermath of losing one of my children, was something that she was immensely proud of, and how confident I was in every room I walked into. And it was all this beautiful stuff that is so nice to see yourself through the lens of others and how much they love you. And she wrote this beautiful letter of how much I meant to her and how much respect and admiration she had for me and how I show up in life. And I don't want them to ever think that I lived a life less than what it was meant to be. Everything that is, and what I've done with it so far, I'm proud of, and I intend on living the fuck out of what's left of my life, and not from a place of fear or martyrdom to grief and in a less than version of my life because of the things that have happened in it. I plan on, like I said, living the fuck out of my life and really enjoying what's left of this ride. And I hope it's a long one. But in the event that it's somehow not, my intention is to show the girls that I don't get to know when my time is up. I don't know what's on my card, but I'm not going to let that scare me. I'm going to let that drive the motivation that I have to really live and to love and to really let people know that I love them and not take anyone or anything for granted, and really also not allow myself to treat myself in a way that I know that the person who's no longer here would never treat me that way. They would never blame me for not knowing or for not facilitating something being better, or whatever it is that you might be beating yourself up over because you wish that things had gone a certain way or differently or whatever. Really, if you put yourself in the perspective of the loved one and talk to yourself as if it was from them, because the reality is that we choose suffering. We facilitate suffering. And sometimes it's a slippery slope and we head down that little rabbit hole without realizing we're doing it, and it happens on a subconscious level, and then we're suddenly in quicksand and we don't know how to get ourselves out. I'm not saying it's your fault you've slid down there. I'm saying it's your accountability to get yourself out, because the awareness that I've actually facilitated this. I've fed and watered thoughts about whatever it is that has, or I've let the imposter syndrome thing on my shoulder talk a negative talk to me about how I don't get to live and grieve simultaneously, that I have to be stuck here feeling feelings of guilt or regret or remorse over how I believe things should have or could have been differently. And I've somehow allowed this. There is an accountability there, because this isn't happening outside of me. Nobody's, invading my privacy and coming into my home to point fingers at me and attack me or any of this. We don't need that. When we've got the enemy in our own camp and it's our own internal dialogue, we don't need haters and enemies outside of ourselves, because we'll unravel ourselves just fine if we're not careful. So it's not about blame, it's about accountability. It's about the awareness that if I'm not currently living the version of my life that I know is possible, or even if I don't know it, you're here. You're here listening for a reason, because there's a part of you, a deeper part of you, that knows that it's possible. And that's why you've gotten this far into the podcast, whether this is the first episode you've listened to or you've listened to every single one of them. You're here for a reason. You're here because you know that life can be better, that I don't have to live in martyrdom to my grief and loss, and I don't have to stop existing because they have stopped existing. In this realm anyway, I don't know what happens after this life, but because they're no longer here shouldn't mean it's the end of you. It may be the end of you as you know it, and as I said before, you're in the rubble of a life you no longer recognize, but it also can be the beginning of a beautiful new becoming where you get to put the pieces of your currently very shattered heart back together in a way that doesn't resemble anything that was before, but is this really beautiful new version of a life that you get to choose. It's a choice. It's a choice to stay stuck in denial and grief. It's just a really confronting truth to face, that this choice is mine. I'm choosing this. I'm sitting too long with feeding and watering the wrong thoughts around sadness or denial or depressive kind of things. And if I make a different choice, I can have a different outcome. And so a lot of learning to live and grieve simultaneously is about accountability. It's about learning to start off with that I actually have a lot more control over a lot more aspects of my life than I might have realized. And whilst I don't control those things outside of myself, like external factors or people or their behaviors or their perceptions, I do get to impact and control all of that for myself. And so when we start to take that kind of accountability, what we do is we facilitate a capacity to live and grieve that we may never have imagined was possible. And let's be real, you probably find yourself right here in a degree of grief following a loss you never imagined was possible. So I don't blame you for not having any capacity to imagine that there can be a life on the other side of this grief and loss that lends itself to you describing yourself as the happiest you've ever been. Yeah, of course you're not imagining that, because you didn't imagine you'd find yourself here to begin with. But it actually doesn't matter, because whether you can imagine it or not doesn't remove, negate, or invalidate the truth of it, and that it is possible. And that if we do the things that are necessary and take accountability for the parts that we can, and we act responsibly and with intention, we can absolutely choose our life moving forward and our lived experience, and however that unfolds, how we let that impact us, who we let ourselves become as a result of it. And that is one of the most powerful gifts you can give yourself, is the capacity to choose, the awareness that everything is a choice and that I am actually going to make these choices consciously, and in doing so be rewarded immensely and in ways that I might not be able to see right now. But if you trust the process and you make the choices and you do so on repeat, and you choose gratitude and you choose to say yes to grief, and there's subtle ways, whether it's getting out of bed today, whether it's that you showered, it's, the acknowledgement that I can't control this, but yes, this person is gone. Whether it is the early days of saying yes to grief, and I think I mentioned it in the first episode, the saying yes to grief looked at more like being able to start to plan a celebration of life. It was the essence of stopping resisting what was and denying it, because whilst it served us in the beginning as a survival instinct, it only served to perpetuate our suffering by keeping us stuck in the denial of what is. And so I would encourage you to start saying yes to grief, to start implementing the daily practice of gratitude, because that is a string that once you pull it, there is no end. There is always, always more things to be grateful for. And the more we look for them, the more we see them, the more our brain goes about a fact-finding mission to find evidence to support whatever it is we're looking for, and that's things to be grateful for. And it lends itself to your physiology then complying by releasing feel-good hormones, and your body becoming a much nicer and safer and more peaceful place for your soul to reside. So I would strongly recommend it, highly. What these things will do is start facilitating the capacity that we all have to start stepping into our main character energy and realizing that this is my one red hot crack at life. and as beautiful but also ugly and terrifying and anxiety-inducing this roller coaster can be, it's yours. It's yours to live and to take the lead and really be the main character in what's left of this journey. And you might not have done it before now, but what better time to start than now, because that's all we actually have. And we never know when our time is up or our card says that our contract is over. But I would encourage you to live the fuck out of now, what's left of this life, because all we really have is now. And I'm very, very grateful that your now has been spent by consciously deciding to listen to this podcast. I really do consider it a privilege to be a part of your journey, and I'm so grateful that you're here. And I am very sorry for your loss and the ways that life has let you down or been unkind to you. But I'm also very, very excited for everything that life has yet to offer. And I'm so stoked to have you here on this journey with me. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of Why Mindset Matters. I'm Eslana Loa. You can follow me on Instagram at Eslana Loa. I very much look forward to sharing everything that I have to offer in the upcoming episodes of Why Mindset Matters. I will see you there.